I froze when I saw my wife leaving hand in hand with another man at the end of the company party, as if time had stopped just for me. I was still holding a half-empty glass, but my dry throat wouldn't allow me to swallow any more. My eyes didn't blink. They just watched. They watched that image with a coldness that only shock could provide. They walked slowly, as if accustomed to it, as if it were routine. They laughed at something I would never know what it was, and she smiled like she hadn't smiled at me in a long time. A lively, knowing, intimate laugh. There was something there that couldn't be built overnight. It wasn't impulse. It was familiarity. It was continuity. It was the reflection of what had been happening for a long time without my knowledge. I waited for them to turn the corner and disappear. I didn't make a fuss. I didn't scream. I didn't chase them. I simply walked away, taking with me the last image of what we once called love. And that's exactly where the story begins. It's funny how love ends in silence, even after so much noise was made to begin. We spend a lifetime trying to build something firm, solid, true. And suddenly, everything collapses with the muffled sound of footsteps on a wet sidewalk. No one prepares us for the emptiness that sets in when the person who slept next to you wakes up in another bed, with another body, with a different scent. It's a void that makes no sound, but echoes within. An absence that hurts more than any aggressive presence. For days, weeks, I relived that scene, the intertwined fingers, the inclined smile, the naturalness of her steps. As if she had forgotten me before she even left. The hardest thing to face wasn't the betrayal itself, but realizing that she had already left emotionally long before my gaze caught sight of her footsteps. It took me a while to confront her. Not out of cowardice, but because I wanted to be sure it wasn't just a delusion in my head. I clung to any possible justification. Maybe it was a friend, maybe she was helping someone drunk leave. Maybe. But deep down, my heart already knew. Because love, when betrayed, warns. It changes the taste of coffee, changes the feel of skin, even changes the way we close the door. The body knows when it's no longer wanted. And no matter how much we try to ignore it, the truth slips through our fingers. When I finally confronted her, too late, she simply said, "I just wanted to feel alive again." As if that justified the rift she'd made in our marriage, as if my love had died first. But it hadn't. My love was still breathing when she left. I remember the way she trembled when she lied. Her eyes that averted. And the silence that screamed louder than any words. What killed me wasn't that she'd looked for someone else, but the fact that she'd never told me she was unhappy. That she needed something more. That she had doubts. She decided to bury me in silence, and then she even wanted flowers on my grave. She stayed. Her lover vanished. Like all those who have no intention of staying. He disappeared the same way he arrived, stealthily, lightly, irresponsibly. He left behind only the scent of a mistake and the mess of a heart that thought it was loving, but was only running away. And she, now without ground, without applause, without secrets, began to live with the absence she chose and the regret that arrived late. Because it's always like that, the adrenaline of novelty is deceiving. But after the dust settles, reality bites in. And when she looked around, I was no longer there. It took me a while to rebuild. It wasn't quick, nor was it pretty. I found myself broken in places I didn't even know existed. I felt anger. Guilt. I felt inadequate. I felt ridiculous. I tried to understand where I went wrong. What was missing? I tried to find the reason for the abandonment within myself. But then I realized, it wasn't about me. It was about her. It was about how much she missed herself. And I couldn't have filled that hole, no matter how much love I gave. There are pains that not even love heals. There are voids that only those who carry them can try to understand. And sometimes, those who betray not because they lack love for the other, but because they lack love for themselves. And yet, that doesn't lessen the pain of those left behind. Little by little, a new love appeared. Not with the intensity of a gale, but with the constancy of a breeze. Someone with a calm gaze, who didn't compete with my silence, but walked beside it. Who listened to me patiently, without trying to mend my cracks. Who understood that affection is also respect, and that love is a choice, not an escape. With her, I learned that it's possible to start over without rushing. That it's possible to be loved lightly after being hurt so deeply. And then, when she reached out to me, I listened without anger. I forgave. Not for her, but for myself. Because forgiveness is the final point we put to move on with life with greater peace. And when she cried, saying she traded the certain for the uncertain, that she missed our laughter, our routine, our small promises, I simply said, I missed it too. But now, I don't miss it anymore. Time passed. And she remained there, trying to understand when she lost herself. Revisiting our old photos. Remembering Sunday afternoons, unfinished series, the way I covered for her without her asking. Trying to find where it was that killed that love she would give anything to have back today. But life doesn't give replays, it only teaches lessons. And when she tried to return, she found another man. Me. The same face, the same name, but different. And what she didn't know, was that on that very day of the party, before she walked through the door with another man, I had a little box in my pocket. I was going to ask her to renew our vows that night. The ring is still there. Not as a keepsake. But as proof that love, when not cherished, turns to stone. And now she will spend the rest of her life remembering that she exchanged true love, for a look that didn't last. But that wasn't the only thing she missed. Because some time later, alone in her new apartment, she remembered the first time I called her home. She remembered the night she slept on my chest and said she'd never felt so safe. She remembered the mornings I'd make her coffee just the way she liked it, even though she hated coffee. She remembered our comfortable silence, the kind where two souls rest together without needing to say anything. She remembered that stay, I'd say even after bad days. And she realized, finally, that she'd never felt at home with anyone else again. And now, she just lives. But not the way she wanted. Because the worst punishment for betrayal isn't always being forgiven or not. It's realizing, over time, that the place you destroyed, was the only place where she was truly loved. And what she doesn't know yet, is that the person I'm with today has a secret about her. A secret that even I didn't imagine. And it's in that secret that everything changes. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize and never condone any form of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but the feelings are real, because the pain of someone who's been betrayed is more devastating than any ending. Each narrative reflects the consequences of thoughtless choices. Brace yourself, what's coming next is a shocking, intense, and unforgettable story. Enjoy listening. They met on a rainy November afternoon, inside a small bookstore where almost no one entered. He was looking for a gift for his younger sister, she was absent-mindedly leafing through an old novel with a faded cover. The encounter wasn't explosive, there were no stumbles or movie-like glances, but it was real. It was simple, as everything that truly matters tends to be. His name was Daniel, calm, observant, with a rare patience these days. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who showed affection in discreet details, the coat draped over her shoulders when it was windy, the care taken with her constantly discharged cell phone, the reminders to drink water during busy days. Her name was Laura, intense, direct, with an easy laugh that he found beautiful even when it came after bad jokes. They had different temperaments, but something between them worked like a silent balance. They complemented each other effortlessly, as if the universe had molded them for each other without haste. They started dating a few months later and soon became inseparable. They had a connection that went beyond words. It was the way she would rest her head on his shoulder during movie credits, or the way he always knew when she needed silence, not advice. Friends said they had the look of an old couple, the kind you see walking hand in hand, their hair already graying and their eyes still full of affection. And that was what Daniel wanted. Stability. Peace. A place where he could put down roots. Laura, on the other hand, had an unstoppable energy. She dreamed of seeing new places, having different experiences, experiencing everything life had to offer. But in Daniel, she found a haven. And for a long time, that haven was enough. They lived in a small but cozy apartment. Daniel worked as a designer at a tech company and spent much of his time working from home, surrounded by screens and sketches. Laura worked in the events department of a renowned company, and her routine was much more chaotic. Meetings, clients, short trips, long hours on her feet. The difference in pace between them was never a problem, on the contrary, it brought a certain dynamic to their relationship. He balanced her impulses, she pushed him out of his comfort zone. When they were together, everything fell into place. Weekends were sacred, series marathons, impromptu dinners, board games she always won, and loud laughter throughout the house that seemed eternal. But like almost everything in everyday life, the details began to fade. First, morning kisses became just a hurried, good morning. Then, dinners together became snacks on the couch at different times. Late-night conversations gave way to fatigue, and spontaneous caresses were replaced by quick, automatic touches. It wasn't all at once, nor was it intentional. It was time, it was routine, it was life unfolding between two people who still loved each other but were beginning to forget how to show it. Daniel felt it. He didn't say it, but he felt it. He noticed that Laura was coming home from work more tired, but also more distant. She smiled less. She played with her cell phone too much. And sometimes, when he talked about his projects, she seemed to listen with only half-hearted attention. Still, he tried. He cooked her favorite dishes, even when she said he didn't need to. I saved reminders on her phone with loving phrases. He planned short trips, just the two of us, to quiet places. She thanked him, but with a look that was no longer the same. The truth is, deep inside, Laura missed something she couldn't name. A restlessness that grew with the months and that she tried to suffocate with work, with commitments, with busyness. It wasn't a lack of love. It was a lack of feeling something new. Something that reminded her she was still alive, that she could still surprise herself. But she didn't say it. She kept it to herself, because she knew Daniel was a good man, and hurting someone like that hurt more than any guilt. Her friends noticed the change. They asked if everything was okay, if the relationship still made sense, if she still saw herself with him in the future. Laura didn't know how to answer. Sometimes, yes. Other times, she wanted to run. But every time Daniel looked at her with that serene expression of someone who trusts, her heart sank. Because he trusted. Because he believed. And she, as lost as she was, didn't want to be the one to break it. He didn't deserve it. And that made her even more confused. As if love, in itself, wasn't enough. As if it were possible to love and still desire something outside of that love. Over time, they began to argue more. Nothing explosive. But enough to leave a mark. He complained about her absence. She accused him of not understanding her routine. He said he just wanted more time together. She responded that she was exhausted, that he didn't know how hard she tried. Their conversations were laced with unspoken pain, pent-up frustrations, expectations neither of them knew how to express. And after the silence that followed the arguments came the apologies. The cold hugs. The soulless kisses. The weight of someone trying to fix something they don't know where it started to break. Still, there were good times. Laura laughed at his bad jokes. Daniel was moved by the childhood videos she showed him. They shared dreams, still talked about children, about having a dog, about renovating the porch. But the connection that had once been natural now required effort. They had to dig deep to find the sparkle in each other's eyes. And even digging, sometimes they couldn't find it. Daniel began to keep these absences to himself. He no longer complained. He just observed. He tried not to show that he was hurting. Because he thought that if he did everything right, she would be the same again. And Laura. Laura didn't know what she wanted. But she also didn't want to lose. Not yet. There was an attachment there. A history built. Too many memories to be erased with one decision. And that made her stay. Their anniversary was approaching, and Daniel, once again, took the initiative. He planned a dinner at a private restaurant, a place she had mentioned years ago, when they were just starting out. He had a small wooden box engraved with their names, filled with handwritten notes reminiscing about their time together. Small gestures, but full of meaning. He believed he could rekindle something. That there was still time. That love, even if weakened, could be rekindled if they both wanted it. But wanting isn't always enough when hearts are already heading in different directions, even if still holding hands. That night, Laura arrived late. She was beautiful, but with a tiredness in her eyes that he couldn't interpret. They talked, laughed, and toasted. Daniel handed her the box, and she opened it carefully, read a few notes, smiled, but didn't cry. He expected tears. He expected a tight hug, a sincere, "I love you," something to say she was still there. But what came was a light kiss and a, "Thank you, it's beautiful." Daniel swallowed his disappointment. And in that moment, something in him began to change. He didn't yet know what it was, but something was shifting. And perhaps the saddest part is this: sometimes, love ends without anyone saying it. It just changes places. And by the time one realizes it, the other is too far away to hear the call back. And Laura, even if she didn't say it, was already well on her way to that distance. But Daniel still believed. He still made plans. He still looked at her as if he saw a home. As if he saw the future. And that's precisely why that night remained. Because not all silence is peace. Sometimes, it's the prelude to an end that has already begun. The week began like any other, with the muffled sound of the alarm clock and the smell of the coffee Daniel made every morning, even when Laura rushed out the door and barely had time to take a sip. There was a routine between them that still persisted, like a repeated soundtrack in the background of a movie that has lost its meaning but still plays. He would get up earlier, organize the day's tasks on the kitchen whiteboard, answer emails, and check meeting times, while she rushed back and forth, blow-dryer in one hand and cell phone in the other, torn between her makeup and the incessant messages. Their connection now consisted of practical reminders, notes on the bathroom mirror, or quick messages with shopping lists. Their eyes no longer met as often, and when they did, they seemed averted. Still, Daniel remained there, believing it was just a phase, a curve in the road that would soon return to a straight line. But the line was already breaking, even if he couldn't see it. Laura, for her part, felt a tiredness she couldn't explain. It wasn't physical, it was something deeper, more silent. She woke with a heaviness in her chest and a strange emptiness even on days when everything seemed to be going well. Work remained intense, goals were met, praise poured in, but she didn't feel satisfied. I was beginning to question whether this was truly where I wanted to be, not just professionally, but in life. The nights, once cherished, became just the end of another day. Daniel's touch, so familiar, now stirred an involuntary guilt in her, as if each affectionate gesture were a reminder of a promise she no longer knew she could keep. I still loved him, somehow, but it wasn't enough. What she was looking for, she might not even know, but she felt she wouldn't find it there. At the company, a new project emerged. A major corporate event that would bring together all departments, and Laura was one of the people responsible for organizing it. This meant longer nights, busy weekends, and a complete immersion in the work. Daniel supported her, as he always did. He told her she shone when she was involved in something big, that he admired her dedication, that he was proud of her. And she smiled, thanked him, but something inside her broke. Because that admiration only increased the weight of what she could no longer hide from herself. Project meetings began to become more frequent, as did encounters with the colleagues involved. Among them, there was someone new. A name that came up frequently in conversation, but Daniel didn't know. A face that appeared in some behind-the-scenes photos, but always in the background. Nothing flashy, nothing alarming. Just another coworker. But Laura knew. She knew the bond was growing, even if she denied it to herself. It began with innocent conversations, exchanging messages about the event, laughter between breaks, until the tone changed. The compliments became more personal, the glances lingered longer than they should have, and his presence became an escape from what she no longer felt at home. There was no plan, no calculation. It slipped away, as all betrayals do, ones that begin not with the body, but with the mind. Daniel remained the same. He continued trying, hoping, believing. And perhaps that was the detail that hurt Laura the most. The fact that he hadn't changed. The fact that he was still the same man who made her fall in love. The same man who called her home. But she was no longer the same. The day before the project's closing party, Laura arrived home late. She said there was a presentation rehearsal, last-minute adjustments, and that everything would be perfect. Daniel noticed a different perfume, sweeter, less familiar. He commented casually, as if trying to capture a detail, and she simply smiled, saying she'd received a new sample. That night, the two shared the couch, but not the silence. He tried to strike up a conversation, show her funny videos, talk about his niece who had started walking. She responded distractedly, her eyes more focused on her phone notifications than the world around her. When they finally retired for the night, Laura turned over and fell asleep too quickly, as if escaping his gaze was easier than facing what she knew she was doing. The party took place in a spacious hall, decorated with warm lights and soft music. Daniel arrived alone, hours after the planned start. Laura was waiting for him near the bar, surrounded by colleagues. Her red dress highlighted her skin tone, and the smile on her face was light, relaxed, almost girlish. He approached, and she greeted him with a short kiss, a cold hug. They spent much of the night chatting with other guests, laughing in different groups, as if they weren't there as a couple. When they danced together for a few moments, there was an exchange of glances that almost said it all. Daniel tightened his grip on her waist, trying to remember what united them. She reflexively pulled away seconds later, explaining that she needed to discuss something with the event coordinator. And he simply nodded, watching her disappear into the faces. It was past midnight when Daniel decided to leave. He was tired, uncomfortable, with the feeling of being in a place that was no longer his. As he crossed the side corridor of the ballroom, he saw Laura from afar. She was smiling. But not at him. She was holding hands with another man. It wasn't a casual greeting or a misinterpreted gesture. It was intimate, natural. They walked slowly, as if they didn't need to hide anything. Daniel's body froze, his eyes fixed on that image that didn't match what he believed until then. The world around him went silent, the voices turned to noise, and all that remained was the image of the woman he loved walking with another man out of the party, as if it were just another ordinary night. He didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't chase after her. He just stood there, still, letting his heart sink into a silence that knew no end. He waited until they both disappeared around the corner. The glass he was holding slipped from his hand, but he didn't even notice. He walked away silently, feeling the ground beneath his feet crumble inch by inch. On the way home, he didn't cry. He didn't think about anything. He just repeated, over and over, the last image he had of her, her fingers intertwined with another man's, the smile that had once been his alone, now offered to someone he didn't even know. And the cruelest thing of all was how natural it was. As if it had been a part of her life for a long time. As if he were the last to know of her own demise. When he arrived at the apartment, everything seemed exactly where it belonged. The pillows were arranged, the scent of lavender in the air, the framed photos on the shelf. But there was something missing. Something that would never return. He lay down on the bed, still in his party clothes, and stared at the ceiling as if searching for an explanation. The pain didn't come like a knife, but like a steady, slow wave that took over everything. He tried to remember the last few weeks, the clues he hadn't wanted to see, the nights she'd been slow to arrive, the messages she'd quickly deleted. Everything made sense now. The distance, the exhaustion, the empty gaze. And yet, at the same time, it made no sense at all. Because he still loved her. He still believed. He still wanted to wake up and discover it was all just a misinterpreted nightmare. But it wasn't. The next morning, Laura arrived home as if nothing had happened. She held a coffee for him and told him the party had been a success. Daniel watched her. Every word, every movement. And for a moment, he thought he could pretend. That he could swallow the pain and carry on. But something inside him was already breaking. And when she went into the bathroom to shower, he knew. There was no turning back. But what Daniel didn't yet know, was that what he saw that night was just the tip of the iceberg of something much bigger. Something that would change not only the way he saw Laura, but the way he saw their entire story. A secret she'd hidden more carefully than the betrayal itself. And that, when it came to light, would challenge everything he believed to be true. Laura spent the next few days in an almost automatic state, as if trying to prolong the illusion that nothing had changed, as if there was still room for them both in the house. She still left the wet towel on the bed, still forgot the coffee cooling in the sink, still asked him to get something from the market as if demanding without realizing she'd already lost the right to ask for anything. Daniel, on the other hand, was silent. Not the silence of embarrassment, but the silence of profound disappointment, of the awareness that there was nothing more to be said that would erase what his eyes had already seen. He didn't shout, didn't demand explanations, didn't confront her in the heat. He simply began to observe. Her every gesture was now another detail in the composition of a painting that, no matter how painful it was, he needed to finish. Because deep down, he already knew, he wanted the truth. All of it. Uncut. No half-truths. And when it came, he would be ready. Or at least he would pretend to be. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, after days of exchanging nothing more than short, empty phrases, Daniel arrived home early. He found Laura sitting on the couch, her computer on her lap, her expression distant. When she saw him, she smiled slightly, as if still waiting for an answer. He dropped his keys on the table, went to the kitchen, got a glass of water, and came back. He stood, looking at her silently. She asked if everything was okay, and he replied with the calm of someone who no longer expected anything, "We need to talk." She swallowed hard, put down her laptop, and crossed her arms, as if she knew exactly what was going on. But what she didn't know was that Daniel didn't want an explanation for what she'd seen at the party. He wanted more. He wanted to understand what had been happening for months. What she hid behind her carefully chosen words, behind her eyes that no longer looked him straight in the eye. Laura hesitated. She took a deep breath, looked around, as if seeking support from the surroundings, and then began to speak. She admitted there was someone. She said she didn't know how it happened, that it wasn't planned, that she felt confused, empty, and that she had found in the other person a distraction, a sense of newness. Daniel listened without interrupting. He simply nodded, as if each word confirmed something he had already felt. But then he asked what he hadn't yet said aloud, "Was that all, Laura?" She looked away, and in that second, the world seemed to freeze. The pause was too long to be innocent. He persisted, his voice firm, without anger, but with a precision that cut through. "Is there something else you're hiding from me?" And then she broke. Laura brought her hands to her face and began to cry, not the cry of someone who regrets only the betrayal, but the cry of someone carrying something much greater. She couldn't speak, only shook her head, as if struggling with her own conscience. Daniel approached, sat beside her, and in a lower voice, repeated, "Tell the truth. All of it." And that's when everything came flooding back. Daniel had heard the name of the man she'd gotten involved with once or twice. But he didn't know that this same man was someone who, months earlier, had looked for a job with her help. At the time, needing a referral, Laura introduced him to the department headed by Daniel's sister. She used her husband's name, without his knowledge, to get her new colleague a temporary position. His name, his prestige, his trust, all were used as silent currency in a favor with a hidden agenda. And worse, Daniel's own sister had been harmed by the new hire's conduct, using his position as a shield to commit petty internal fraud. When everything came to light within the company, the scandal was quietly hushed up, but Daniel's sister paid the price with an unfair warning that directly affected her position. Laura knew. She knew everything. And she never said a word. Daniel felt his heart freeze. His hands trembled, but he didn't move. What hurt most wasn't just the physical betrayal, but the moral betrayal, the breach of trust on a level that went beyond marriage and affected his family. The use of his name, his integrity, for something dirty and self-serving. She tried to explain, saying she hadn't imagined things would turn out this way, that at first it was just an innocent favor, but that she'd lost her way. She said her involvement with the man happened later, that it wasn't premeditated. But none of that could erase the fact that she'd crossed all the lines. Daniel stood up. He paced around the apartment, unable to breathe properly. Images came to him like flashes, family dinners, smiles, compliments, his sister being wronged and him unable to understand why, defending the company, blaming the system, while the truth was within his own home. Laura cried, begged for forgiveness, said she didn't know what else to do. And Daniel, for the first time in a long time, felt there was nothing left to save. It was no longer just a relationship lost to time. It was an irreversible breakdown of what held everything together, respect. He sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, as if needing to hold on to something firm to keep from falling further. She approached, tried to touch him, but he pulled away with a light gesture, as if he no longer recognized that hand. He looked into her eyes and said, without shouting, without drama, "You didn't just destroy us, Laura. You destroyed who I was with you. And that I don't know if I can rebuild." That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat on the porch, staring at the dark sky, trying to understand when everything had fallen apart without him realizing it. The betrayal was painful enough, but the hidden secret, the use of his name, the consequences for someone he loved as a part of himself, it was too much. And while the world slept, he understood something that had perhaps been inside him for days: their story was over. Not because the love was gone, but because the trust was murdered. And Laura, now, would have to live with the knowledge that, through thoughtless choices, she had lost not only the man who loved her, but the right to be remembered lightly by him. Their life, once made of rituals and silent promises, was now only silence. But a silence that screamed everything that no longer needed to be said. Daniel knew the road ahead would be long, but a certainty began to grow within him: he wouldn't carry this pain forever. And somewhere, though he didn't know where, peace awaited him. He just needed to keep walking. Even if, for now, each step still hurt. Daniel spent the entire night awake, but it wasn't the pain that kept him from sleeping. It was something else. It was the feeling that something inside him had finally ceased. An internal sound, a noise that had been with him for months, maybe years, and that was now silent. For the first time since the beginning of that collapse, he no longer wanted to understand, or relive, or fix. He simply wanted to get away, like someone abandoning a house in ruins before the roof collapses completely. The sky was already lightening when he got up from the porch chair, grabbed a small backpack, and threw in some clothes, his cell phone charger, his headphones, and a book he was half reading. He passed by the bedroom and looked at Laura sleeping, her features tired, the pillow still damp from the tears she had shed after their conversation. He said nothing. He simply left, closing the door behind him with the care of someone leaving without a trace. He went to his sister's house. He didn't go into details, just asked to spend a few days there. She didn't ask anything, not then. She simply welcomed him with a long, silent hug, the kind that holds the body together when the soul is on the verge of collapse. Daniel slept for hours that afternoon, exhaustion finally overcoming the turmoil. When he woke, he sat at the kitchen table and, with the late afternoon light streaming through the curtains, told her everything. Not just about the betrayal, but about the use of his name, the veiled manipulation, its impact on his sister's career. She listened silently, her eyes welling, and simply shook her head. There was no indignation, no surprise. Only a deep sadness. She said she'd suspected something was wrong, but never imagined it would come from there. From within the family. And that, somehow, it now made sense. In the days that followed, Daniel sought refuge in what was still solid, his profession, his oldest friends, his sister, and, above all, Laura's absence. Her silence was an unexpected relief. She didn't seek him out. She didn't call, didn't text, didn't try to explain anything further. And that spoke volumes. It was as if even she knew there was no room for redemption, not now. But time has a strange rhythm when everything falls apart. Weeks pass, and suddenly, the initial impact fades, making way for deeper questions. And so it was that, after almost a month, Daniel received a message from Laura, asking to talk. She didn't insist, simply asked if they could see each other. And he accepted. Not out of longing. But out of respect for what they'd experienced. Because there was a story there, and it deserved to be concluded with presence, not omission. They arranged to meet in a quiet park, where they used to walk when they first started dating. Laura arrived first. She was different. Not just in her more haggard face or modest clothes, but in something more subtle. There was a break. An exposed vulnerability. When he approached, she didn't smile. She just lowered her head and took a deep breath. Daniel sat beside her, his hands clasped in his lap. She began by saying she didn't expect forgiveness. That not a single day had passed since their last conversation when she hadn't hated herself for everything. But that, despite this, there was something she needed to say. One last fragment of the truth he didn't yet know. She said she tried to distance herself from the other man when she realized what was happening. She said their relationship was never about love, it was about neediness, it was about escape, it was about the adrenaline of feeling seen again. But when the consequences began to mount, she panicked. It was then that her lover contacted her, not to resolve anything, but to say he'd received a job offer in another state and would be leaving in the next few days. And it was there, in that conversation, that Laura understood something she'd never admitted: she'd been used. From the beginning, he knew she had connections, that she could help him move up, that she was emotionally unstable enough to be manipulated. And she fell. She fell in body, she fell in soul, she fell into her own emptiness. And worst of all, when everything fell apart, he left without looking back. Daniel listened to everything with a calm expression. There was no anger. There was no compassion. Just listening. A clear, honest listening, from someone who no longer expected anything but the truth. When she finished, she was silent for a few seconds and then said she understood. He understood that she was lost, that she was hurt, that she had made bad decisions trying to find herself again. But that didn't undo what she had done to him, to his sister, to his name, to his trust. And now, the reason didn't matter. The damage mattered. And that was what he needed to move forward with. Laura cried. She said she still loved him, that she now knew what she'd lost. She'd thought of 1,000 ways to get back, but none were enough. He replied that her love now didn't change anything. Because love, when left untended, becomes a ghost. And he didn't want any more ghosts. He wanted presence, truth, peace. Laura hugged him, a hug full of goodbye, and he hugged her back. They stayed there for a few minutes, unhurried, wordless. When they let go, he smiled for the first time in a long time. A light smile, of relief. And then he walked away, leaving behind the last page of a story that had already ended long before the final period. In the following weeks, life began to take on new dimensions. Daniel rented a small studio near his work, decorating it with a few pieces of furniture and lots of plants. He joined a book club, returned to the photography he had neglected, and, little by little, the pain gave way to reconstruction. It was at one of these club meetings that he met Elena, a woman with a calm voice and steady eyes. There was no immediate passion, no sudden enchantment. But there was something he hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Elena listened attentively, spoke little, smiled with her eyes, and brought a silent presence that welcomed without demanding. They began hanging out frequently. First as friends, then as something that grew between conversations. Daniel didn't hide his story. He told her everything. And she didn't judge him or try to console him. She simply said that the hardest part of betrayal isn't being left, it's being forgotten within a relationship where you still believed you were there. And he understood that was it. He hadn't just been betrayed. He'd been forgotten by someone who still slept with him. With Elena, everything was different. There was no rush. There were no idealizations. There was truth. And that was enough. Laura, on the other hand, fell into a period of silence. She moved to a smaller apartment, distanced herself from her old colleagues, quit her job, and decided to start over. Too late to regain what she'd lost, but early enough not to lose herself forever. She began writing letters she never sent, loose memories, memories that came like little stabs that she needed to get off her chest. With every word she wrote, I felt the weight of regret. Not for the end, but for having destroyed something that, if taken care of, could have been eternal. Time passed. Some pains heal silently, others continue to throb on rainy days, in smells that return, in songs that play without warning. Daniel learned to live with the scars, but he never again gave up his respect. Elena walked by his side, with a serene firmness that reminded him that it was still possible to believe. And it was on a random Sunday, as they walked hand in hand through a street market, that he stopped in front of a bookstall and saw an old edition of that novel that, years before, Laura had been leafing through in the bookstore when they met. He picked up the book, smiled, and simply said, "It's curious how some stories end long before the end." Elena didn't ask. She just squeezed his hand, and they continued on. Because sometimes, moving on is the bravest way to start over. And deep down, that's what Daniel had learned: love may end, but what can never end is self-respect. And those who choose absence must learn to live with the void they've created. After their encounter in the park, something inside Laura broke in a way she could no longer hide, even to herself. Daniel's silence, though polite and serene, weighed more heavily than any scream. His absence, for the first time, felt absolute. He was no longer a body sleeping in another bed or a blocked number on her phone screen. He was a real past, a constant reflection of the choice she'd made and the consequences that now nipped at her heels. She returned home dry-eyed, as if even tears were no longer an accessible resource. She sat on the couch and stared at the space that had once been divided, but now screamed loneliness in every corner. The photos had disappeared from the shelves. The mugs, which once came in pairs, were now mismatched. Daniel's belongings had disappeared without fanfare, like everything he did, silently, but with impact. The routine dragged on at a pace that was at odds with the world's time. Laura wandered through her own days, trying to reconstruct some meaning from what was left. She tried to return to writing in her diary, a pursuit she had abandoned years before. The pages now contained more regret than memories. The guilt, which had previously come in waves, was now constant. There were no longer enough distractions. Her lover had disappeared as if he had never existed. No message, no attempt to reconnect. She discovered, through social media, that he was already in another city, in another position, with another woman. He didn't even mention the past. And this indifference, this lightness with which he turned the page, was perhaps the cruelest blow. She realized then that she had surrendered her story, her name, her home, for someone who didn't even consider her name relevant. And the weight of it was beyond words. Laura began avoiding places she frequented with Daniel. She changed her commute to work, declined invitations from mutual friends, and even distanced herself from her own family. Not out of overt shame, but because she no longer knew how to fit into the world she had once been a part of. Her mother, in a quick phone call, tried to understand what had happened. But Laura simply replied that she needed time. Time was all she had now, though she didn't know what to do with it. The apartment, once full of life, now felt like a stage set for someone who no longer existed. The objects remained in the same place, but they no longer belonged to anyone. She stopped cooking, stopped tending the plants, and let the furniture gather dust. It was as if her life force had been trapped in that last conversation in the park, along with the hug that, more than a goodbye, was proof that she didn't deserve the love she once received. On the other side, Daniel walked at a pace that blended reconstruction and caution. There was no euphoria, no rush to get involved again. Elena was a frequent companion, but never invasive. She observed him patiently, without forcing closeness, but offering her presence. Together, they frequented cultural events, quiet cafes, and photography exhibitions. Little by little, Daniel began to enjoy activities that had previously been done automatically. He also enjoyed his own company, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. He began to reflect more on his own limits, on how he had ignored the signs of wear and tear for so long, insisting on saving something that was already beyond repair. He understood that loving too much is also dangerous when you love someone you don't know how to care for. He learned that love shouldn't demand sacrifices so profound that they cost one's own dignity. Still, there were nights when he would wake with a start, as if reliving the last few months in unrelenting flashes. At these times, he would walk to the porch, sit in silence, and watch the distant hustle and bustle of the streets. It was in these moments that he thought most about everything that had been. Not with longing, but with wonder. Wonder at having lived a story that now seemed so distant from him. Laura appeared in these memories with blurred lines. No longer as the woman he loved, but as the woman who failed to cherish that love. The pain gave way to lucidity. And lucidity, to relief. Because there was no longer any desire to return. Only the certainty that he had done what he could. And that was enough. On a rainy Saturday, Daniel received an unexpected call from his ex-mother-in-law. It was short, restrained, and her voice choked. She simply said that Laura had suffered a severe anxiety attack and was hospitalized for observation. She hadn't asked him to go. She simply felt the need to let him know. Daniel hung up the phone and stood still for a few seconds. He took a deep breath, took a sip of water, and went to the window. Outside, the world went on. Cars passed, people ran with umbrellas, children played on the sidewalks. Everything was alive. He was too. For a moment, he considered going. Out of instinct, out of humanity, out of respect for the past. But then he remembered her words, her choices, her silences. He remembered his sister, the wound to her pride, the consequences that still weighed heavily. And he decided not to go. Not out of revenge. But because, sometimes, respecting another's pain also means knowing not to be their anesthetic. However, that same night, when he told Elena what had happened, she didn't respond with pre-written phrases. She simply said she understood, but that perhaps, one day, he would need to see Laura not as the woman who betrayed him, but as someone who had also lost herself. Daniel listened in silence, and something in his chest seemed to loosen a little. Perhaps there was still hurt. But the anger, that was gone. And that was what allowed him to move forward with ease. The following days brought new rhythms. He and Elena decided to take a short trip, something simple, just to breathe new air. During this trip, between hikes along trails and coffees under trees, Daniel began to see the future more clearly. Not the idealized future he had envisioned with Laura, but another, one of freedom, mutual respect, and shared peace. The past was now a story with an end. And the end, though painful, was necessary. Laura was discharged after a few days and returned home, now even emptier than before. She began regular therapy, cut off contact with people who reminded her of what she tried to be to please others. She began to take care of her health with discipline, resumed exercising, and for the first time in months, began sleeping better. I still dreamed of Daniel sometimes, but this dream was different. He didn't speak. He just watched her, with the same calm gaze as when I told her I didn't hate her. That gaze haunted her for weeks, until she finally understood. He didn't hate her because he no longer expected anything. And when someone stops expecting, there's no more room for reconquest. This was the hardest emptiness to bear. The knowledge that, even though I regretted it, I no longer had a place in his life. She wrote a letter she would never deliver. It was more for herself than for him. In it, she described the days when she felt alive with him, the days when she lost herself, the moments when she traded everything for nothing. She admitted her cowardice, her negligence, and confessed that, if she could return, she would have chosen to face him honestly rather than betray him in silence. But time is cruel to those who do not know the value of the present. And now all she could do was live with the memories she chose to abandon. Meanwhile, Daniel took new photos. Elena, with her reserved manner, began to appear in small snapshots, a hand holding a book, a discreet smile reflected in a cafe window, their shadows cast on the sidewalk at dusk. There was no rush, no labels. There was presence. There was truth. And that was all he needed. There was no longer any need to prove anything to anyone. No need to justify what he'd experienced, no need to explain what he felt. Life was once again his alone. And in this new beginning, there was no longer room for illusions or for people who only half-heartedly loved. There was only one path. And he was finally walking it on his own 2 feet. Summer was approaching with its abundant light and longer days, but Laura felt time dragging on, as if each hour demanded a superhuman effort from her to continue. It was no longer about crying or blaming herself, but about facing an existence that was now rewriting itself without direction. The past months had forced her to look at herself as never before, to face the ruins she had left not only in others, but in herself. For the first time in a long time, she began attending a support group for people who had faced destructive breakups. There, among strangers who courageously spoke about their failures, she recognized parts of herself that could still be saved. A white-haired man said in one of the circles that sometimes the true punishment of a betrayal comes not from without, but from the echo that lingers within, in the memories that refuse to die. And Laura understood that Daniel's silence, though cruel, was also the chance he gave her to rebuild herself without having to carry her on his shoulders. At one of these gatherings, she met Vera, a middle-aged woman who had destroyed her own marriage by falling in love with someone younger. Her pain lay not only in the loss of her husband, but also in the estrangement from her children, who began to treat her coldly. Vera told Laura, one particularly difficult afternoon, that regret was like walking with stones in your shoes, you keep going, but you feel the weight with every step. These conversations made her realize that moving on wasn't about forgetting what happened, but learning to walk with what was left. And that was when, almost without realizing it, Laura began to come back to life. She began taking a creative writing course, resumed reading the books she'd been piling up for years, and began writing short pieces, memoirs disguised as fiction. Her therapist said this was a good sign, a sign that she was finally taking responsibility for her experience without defining herself solely by it. Across town, Daniel's life was moving at a different pace. Elena was increasingly present, but with a lightness that made everything seem spontaneous. He had met her parents at a simple lunch, where they spoke little about the past and much about the future. Her father, a simple man, told stories of his time as a mechanic and said that the secret to fixing any machine was to listen to the noise it made, and not try to rush it. Daniel heard this as if it were a lesson for his own soul. This was not the time to rush, but to keep listening to the inner noises until they quieted. And it was in this rhythm that he decided to see his sister again, now with a different perspective. She already knew about Elena, had acknowledged her presence through small comments, but had yet to meet her in person. They decided to have dinner together at home, just the 3 of them. The evening passed peacefully, amid light conversations and laughter that seemed real, not out of obligation, but out of relief. For the first time since the end, Daniel felt that his family, his essence, was intact. The betrayal had taken nothing that he could not rebuild with truth. By coincidence or irony of fate, Laura learned about this dinner from her old neighbor, who still followed her on social media. There was no mockery in the message she sent, just a comment, "I'm glad he's smiling again." Laura read those words dozens of times before deleting the conversation. She realized that, even without him, Daniel still occupied spaces she could no longer reach. And that hurt in a different way. Not out of jealousy, but because she knew his smile no longer had anything to do with her. His smile was now peace, not a memory. One Saturday morning, while walking through the craft fair near her neighborhood, Laura bumped into a woman who looked vaguely familiar. They exchanged a brief glance, a polite apology, and continued on their way. Minutes later, she recognized her. It was Daniel's sister. Her heart raced, but she didn't back down. She respected the space, didn't force a conversation that might not have been welcome. However, later, writing in her notebook, she recounted the scene in detail. She said that, as difficult as it was to accept, some presences had to become ghosts for us to learn the value of absence. And that absence, now, was her harshest teacher. 2 months later, Laura was invited to participate in a short story anthology curated by independent authors. Her text, a narrative about a woman who leaves her home for a love that doesn't love her back, had struck a chord with readers in an unexpected way. She received anonymous messages thanking her for giving words to her guilt. She felt, for the first time, that perhaps her suffering could be useful. Not to justify what she had done, but to warn others not to repeat the same path. Art, now, was her way of apologizing to the world. And it made her feel that dignity was still possible even amidst the rubble. Meanwhile, Daniel and Elena decided to travel together. They went to a historic town surrounded by mountains, where time seemed to slow down. They rented a small house with a flower garden and a balcony overlooking the horizon. On a particularly quiet afternoon, they sat together on the grass. Elena read a book, and Daniel watched her silently. There was no urgency, no anxiety. Just a real presence, his whole body there. He touched her lightly on the arm and said bluntly that he was grateful. Not only for her, but for everything he had experienced before. Because chaos had taught him to recognize peace. Elena smiled, closed the book, and replied that the most beautiful thing about love was this, not to erase the past, but to show that there is still a future. Upon returning from that trip, Daniel found a letter in the mailbox. No sender, just his handwritten name. He recognized Laura's handwriting immediately. He didn't open it. He left it on the table for days, until, one sleepless night, he finally read it. The words were heavy, but they didn't beg for return. They spoke of regret, of awareness, of learning. She said she never expected forgiveness, but that she needed him to know she was trying to be a better version of herself. She said she loved him, even when she lost him, and that she now understood that love is not enough if it isn't treated with respect. She concluded by saying she hoped he was happy, and that he taught her more about love by leaving than by staying. Daniel read it, took a deep breath, and put the letter away. He didn't reply. But he didn't throw it away either. Because part of moving on is understanding that not every ending has to be violent. Sometimes, true justice comes from the silence life offers as an answer. And he was at peace with that. Now, the sound coming from within was different. It was one of lightness. Of someone who had walked through dark places and learned to escape without needing to destroy anyone else. The past had taught him lessons. The present was flourishing. And the future, he was still writing the future, one step at a time. Time passed as it does when life waits for no one. Silently, swiftly, and relentlessly. Months after that last trip, Daniel found himself in a new cycle, so different from the previous one that even his memories seemed to belong to another existence. He had accepted an invitation to coordinate a design project in a coastal city, something he would never have considered long ago. It wasn't about escaping, but about expanding, breathing an air untainted by the same memories. Elena followed him, not as an emotional crutch or a substitute for the past, but as a partner on the road, someone who built a relationship with him based on truth, presence, and mutual respect. They shared a serene daily life, without grand promises, but with conscious decisions made with the maturity of those who already know what they don't want to repeat. The wounds became scars, visible but harmless, like maps of the journey they both took before meeting. Elena knew everything. And even knowing, she chose to stay. Because true love is made of choices made with eyes wide open. Daniel no longer felt anger or hurt. Only a strange kind of gratitude. Not for having been hurt, but for having learned to rise without carrying the weight of those who had knocked him down. Sometimes he still remembered the past, not with pain, but with clarity. It was impossible to completely forget a story that began with true love, but it was also impossible to ignore how everything had transformed when respect was set aside. Certain memories surfaced in fleeting dreams, in unexpected scents or old songs, but now they passed like the wind. He felt them, acknowledged them, and let them go. The present was too powerful to be overshadowed by any shadow. And he had Elena, his job, his routine built with dignity. He no longer needed answers. Peace was the greatest answer of all. Laura, on the other hand, was at a different end of her rope. She remained in the same apartment, but now the place clearly reflected her loneliness. The living room had been redecorated, the walls painted a different color, but nothing changed the feeling that something essential had been lost there. Her writing began to circulate on small literary blogs. Some readers recognized her as a promising author, but deep down, she knew she didn't write from imagination, she wrote from pain. The words that touched others were, in fact, wounds still open within herself. Writing became her last link to what she once was. She continued in therapy, making progress, but never enough to escape the weight of her choice. Some days, she pretended she had moved on. Other days, she faced the abyss of regret that didn't fade with time. One afternoon, after a short talk on literature she gave at a community library, Laura was approached by a young woman holding one of the short stories she had published in a collection. The girl's eyes were filled with emotion and she said the story had prevented her from cheating on her boyfriend. She said she read it and realized she could destroy something that was still beautiful, just on impulse. At that moment, Laura didn't know what to say. She just smiled, but inside, she crumbled. That young woman had found a detour on the path she herself hadn't had the courage to seek. She returned home in silence and spent the night staring at her reflection in the mirror, wondering what would have been different if she had asked for help before she made her mistake, if she had spoken up instead of remaining silent, if she had trusted in the love that was now just absence. Social media would occasionally share with her small fragments of Daniel's life. She'd see a photo of him in a new cafe, an image of a book he'd recommended, and occasionally a female shadow in the background. She never tried to contact him, never responded to his posts, but watched with the silence of someone who had lost the right to be close. It destroyed her in ways no one could see. Not because she still dreamed of reconciliation, but because she understood, painfully, that Daniel had rebuilt himself with a lightness she would never be able to return. It was as if all she could offer now was shadow, and he had definitely chosen to live in the light. A year later, at a small literary festival, Laura was invited to a debate on guilt, forgiveness, and new beginnings in writing. When the moderator asked about regret and the use of personal pain as raw material, she hesitated. Then, with a firm voice, she said that some choices leave a lasting mark on us. That forgiveness from others is valuable, but the hardest forgiveness is the one we owe ourselves. She said she destroyed what she loved and that, today, she understood that no love survives without respect. Her words caused silence in the audience. And for a brief moment, she felt her pain had served something beyond herself. In the audience, a dark-haired woman with a curious gaze watched her intently. It was Elena. She had come to the event by chance, out of interest in the program and after hearing about the author of confessional texts that touched on themes of betrayal with such precision. She hadn't known it was Laura. When she realized, she felt a jolt. She almost stood up. But she stayed. She listened until the end. And at the end, when Laura stepped off the stage, Elena approached her without hostility. She simply said that she now understood some things. Laura, surprised, murmured an apology she never thought she'd have the chance to say. Elena replied that it wasn't necessary, because nothing she said would change the path Daniel had chosen. But she sincerely hoped that Laura would also find peace. That night was a turning point for both of them. For Elena, the certainty that she had been part of something born only from the destruction of another story, but which still carried no guilt, because it was built on truth. For Laura, it was the final step toward acceptance. There, before the woman who now made Daniel happy, she understood that she would never be a part of his life again. But from that moment on, she could accept this fact without imploding inside. It was the end of a chapter she had prolonged too long. And perhaps the beginning of a less cruel silence. Daniel, upon learning of the meeting between the 2 days later, reacted with a long look at the horizon. He didn't say much. He only said that the past sometimes says goodbye quietly. And that perhaps this was it. The final farewell. The one that comes when no one else expects it. And so, everything ended. Not with shouts, not with reconciliation, but with understanding. Each went their own way. Laura continued writing, becoming a respected author for her courage in transforming guilt into awareness. Elena and Daniel built a new life in a quieter place, opened a small cultural space together, and began to welcome stories, no longer as wounds, but as bridges. Betrayal, like a scar, never faded. But it served as a daily reminder that some choices come at a price too high. And that not every regret comes with a second chance. Sometimes, it comes only with pain. But even pain teaches, if faced truthfully. And love, when it's real, is never destroyed from the outside, it dies from within, when respect is exchanged for a moment of escape. If you've made it this far, please comment on what you thought of this story. What touched you most? What would you do differently? Your opinion is very important to us. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now to continue following stories like this, intense, real, and deeply moving. This story is a reminder that betrayal isn't just a passing mistake, it's a silent earthquake that shatters homes, disintegrates memories, and leaves invisible scars on those affected. It's not worth it. A thoughtless choice can cost everything. And the worst part isn't what's lost, it's who's lost. Here on the channel, we make it clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal. Here, truth matters, loyalty matters. And love is only valid if it's whole.